Gary Gibbon, our political editor, we're here to talk about the first few weeks of Rishi Sunak's time in Number 10, the autumn statement and its fallout. What are you going to tell me?
Well, I'm going to tell you what you probably know. We have just had, even by recent standards, the most extraordinary few weeks when you move from a government, a Conservative government, that is telling you it's revolutionary and is bringing in the biggest tax cuts in one bunch that you've seen in decades. We've moved to another Conservative government that's bringing in the biggest tax rises you've seen in ages. The same party. And we are watching yet another strange convulsion in our politics, watching the reaction of the opposition to that and bracing ourselves for the horrors ahead economically, which our independent forecasters say are our destiny.
Gary, last time we spoke, Liz Truss was still Prime Minister, Kwasi Kwarteng was still Chancellor, most of the mini-budget was still in place. Here we are a few weeks later, and it's all changed. Does it feel like things are a little bit calmer, a little bit quieter in Westminster?
Yes, and that is very much the instruction that Rishi Sunak has had from MPs who wanted him back and Liz Truss gone. Bring us calm, bring us order, stop the boat rocking, and that is the strange new becalmed dispensation in which we find ourselves. And there could be great shocks around the corner. Some of them could be external and some of them could be internal. And Rishi Sunak, we can come to this, seems all too aware that he's in charge of a party that has some management issues, shall we say. This won't necessarily last, but right now, yes, becalmed. Absolutely extraordinary given the chaos we've been through.
He's calmed things down now, but the next 12, 18 months are going to be not just defining for his premiership, but also, you know, this country's economy, how we get through the cost of living crisis, as well as it's also quite defining for how Labour navigates these next 18 months.
There are a lot of questions in that, and yes, all of them are the right questions. A lot of pain ahead. We saw the numbers in the OBR report that came out the same time as the autumn statement. We saw those numbers then crunched by the Resolution Foundation, Institute for Fiscal Studies. However way you dice them, the numbers are awful. The numbers are unprecedented in terms of the hit on household incomes. Very few people will have living memory of a hit on their incomes like what they're about to see. And we don't know quite how people will respond to that. Now, again, it could be things are better than prophesied there. It could be inflation isn't so punishing. It could be the whole energy crisis goes away. But I'm not sure you'd put a lot of money on either of those right now. So we are moving into very difficult times for the economy and for households. And the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have got to work out how to navigate them, what is realistic. It was very interesting yesterday. I'm speaking to you now on Tuesday. Keir Starmer's just talked to the CBI. Yesterday, Rishi Sunak spoke to the CBI. And when he spoke there, Rishi Sunak talked about restoring stability.
I said on the steps of Downing Street that I would put stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. And last week, we did that with a plan to grip inflation and balance the books. I said I would bring fairness and compassion to help the most vulnerable. And we've done that too, not just with record increases in pensions and welfare and help for people's energy bills, but by controlling inflation.
But also trying to inject a little bit of excitement into his politics. And that's going to be a really difficult trick to pull off, because you need a certain amount of excitement, even in a party where you've just been through the chaos of the Liz Truss mini-government. You do need a certain amount of inspiration, leadership and the rest of it. But how much can he really cultivate of that when there isn't much money about? And how much does Labour dare promise of that when there isn't much money about?
I mean, Sunak always warned during the leadership campaign about Trussonomics and that it wouldn't work out and that you were going to have to raise taxes rather than cut them. But was the statement that we heard, was that the one he'd always would have planned? Or was it actually one which was a lot worse, a lot more dire than he'd hoped?
You're absolutely right. He did say that Liz Truss economics was fairy tale economics, and he prophesied gloom and doom if it was experimented with, if they ventured to try to implement the thing. And it all ended, though, even quicker than he ever envisaged, and with more calamity. It went worse than he expected, and that means that he's now having to implement, with Jeremy Hunt, a plan that is tougher than the one he thought he was going to have to implement. He didn't go into too much detail when he was running for the leadership against Liz Truss about what his tough medicine would look like, but we do know that he's had to put more tough medicine on the table in this autumn's statement than he was expecting to originally, because the markets need reassurance.
Because last time we spoke, we were talking about Liz Truss and her sort of ideological mould. She saw herself as a sort of Thatcherite, a devotee of Friedrich von Hayek, the economics father of neoliberalism. Does Sunak have an ideology here? Because, on the programme the other day, you called this statement sort of something similar to a Gordon Brown budget. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant by that was that this is a budget that raises taxes in a stealthy way, and raises quite a lot of taxes in a stealthy way. Freezing thresholds is a very good way of pulling income, dragging people into a tax bracket they otherwise wouldn't be in. And over a period, it does pull in a great whacking amount of tax from people. That was an approach typical of Gordon Brown when he was Tony Blair's Chancellor, and it means that Rishi Sunak is doing something that is a long way from his natural political home. He's a smaller state guy with a hedge fund background. I mean, he didn't come into politics to build the size of the state or the tax take, but he finds himself accidentally there because of as you call it, a Hayekian experiment from Liz Truss that has gone so powerfully wrong.
Does he have a type of ideology? You talked about small C conservative. I remember when you sat down with him the other week, you asked him about, do you believe in a bigger state? Do you think the state should intervene? Do you get a sense that he's actually just, more of a pragmatist?
He's running with the ball where he found it on the pitch, and it's an uncomfortable, muddy game at the moment, and he's getting on with it, but it's not where he'd like to be. It's not where he dreamt of being. It's not what he came into politics to do. But he thinks, he would argue, I think you hear him argue in that question, in that interview, that he's trying to do the most prudent thing possible in the circumstances that he finds himself in. But if that was the biggest tax giveaway for decades that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng cooked up, this is one of the biggest overall tax take packages that we've seen in a very long time. What is it, a few weeks later? And,
as you say, Hunt and Sunak have announced £55 billion in a combination of tax rises and spending cuts. Is there any plus side for the Sunak administration in terms of they seem to be definitely going in a different direction to Truss, in the sense that, she was accused, and her and Kwarteng were accused of focusing on the rich, cutting the top rate of tax, getting rid of, caps on bankers' bonuses. This statement, at least, does seem to be saying it's going to try and help out those worst affected. Is that the bet he's trying to make here, that actually this is, one nation conservatism being seen as actually on the side of working people, those much more harder hit?
There was a moment when Robert Halfon, who's been called one of the sort of great sages of blue-collar conservatism, turned around and told Liz Truss at a 22 committee backbenchers meeting that she was in danger of destroying years of development of working-class Toryism. And he's tried, Rishi Sunak, to turn that round. And so where there is a gift horse to Labour, as it were, and the Liz Truss administration was giving away money to the richest people, he's turned that round. He's trying to take money from the richest, but he's taking money a lot further down the scale than just the very richest. If you look at people who consider themselves on middling income, they're going to lose a lot of money under these plans over the coming years. Yes, the very poorest do look as though they have been protected. The inflation indexing of benefits, and generally when the numbers are crunched, you can see on the distributional analysis that the very poorest are not taking a hit from these measures, the tax measures and the benefit measures. But you don't have to go very far up the scale to find some people hurting. And that's another thing that is causing a lot of disquiet amongst Tory MPs.
A lot of the spending cuts are deferred into after the next election. Is that political posturing, leaving it to the next government, which might be a Labour government, or is that me being cynical? Or is that a proper ploy there?
This is a very well thought out ploy. I mean, there's a consolidation, as it's called. There are penciled in spending cuts for after the general election, which are colossal, and not much before the general election. Now that the government says is because they shouldn't try to exacerbate what is already going to be a recession of some kind. They shouldn't make things worse by bringing forward those spending cuts. But I don't think you'd be the most cynical person on the planet if you also looked at the fact that it is conveniently the other side of a general election. Do they really have any intention of doing those cuts? Are they putting them there in order to challenge the Labour Party? If you aren't going to do these cuts, well, which taxes are you going to put up if you win the general election? It's a very sort of George Osborne play, this, and I don't think it's any coincidence that George Osborne has been spotted having some chats with senior figures in this government. So the ghost of Gordon Brown, the ghost of George Osborne hovering over this document.
Now, last weekend, there was a story in the Sunday Times that some politicians in government may want to move towards a new Switzerland-style Brexit deal with the EU. But what does that mean? Well, although Switzerland isn't part of the European Union, it still maintains a close relationship with the bloc. So it has access to the EU single market, which we don't currently, but in return, Switzerland has to contribute to the EU budget and allow the free movement of people. However, at the conference for the Confederation of British Industry this week, Rishi Sunak firmly shut down any talk of a new deal with the EU.
On trade, let me be unequivocal about this. Under my leadership, the United Kingdom will not pursue any relationship with Europe that relies on alignment with EU laws.
But why is Brexit back in the news again? And is there any likelihood of a new relationship with the EU in the months or the years ahead?
There is a general consensus emerging that this was Jeremy Hunt himself pondering what Britain might look like in a few years' time. You find an awful lot of people around Westminster who say, "Ooh, 10 years from now, Britain will probably be closer to the European Union than it is now, and we'll find a different relationship." It's not quite clear how Jeremy Hunt was framing this, but that would not be a completely unlikely way for him to have talked about things. Is it realistic? Is it remotely realistic to talk about a 2-year government, which is pretty much all Rishi Sunak has, moving all the way over to a Swiss relationship, which, by the way, the European Union has been pretty adamant for some time, is not available. They don't like the Swiss relationship. It means endless negotiation. They hate the number of people it absorbs. They hate the fact that the Swiss don't seem to utterly have signed up to or implemented things that they've signed up to. They really insist it is not on offer. So on a number of levels, this is not really a runner in the 2-year window that Rishi Sunak has. One area where there is potential movement is the Northern Ireland Protocol. That's the unfinished business of the Brexit deal. We are still operating on arrangements that were meant to be temporary. We have not concluded, we haven't implemented that part of Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. And the European Union would like us to come to an agreement with them about how we do that. And I think Rishi Sunak is extremely keen to do just that. He indicated at the G20 in Bali to President Biden that he intends to have solved this conundrum, the Northern Ireland Protocol and how you implement it, by April next year, which is the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and also happens to be when President Biden was toying with the idea of flying over to Europe and maybe even to Northern Ireland and commemorating that anniversary.
But is there a sense, though, that there's a sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't with Mr. Sunak when it comes to the autumn statement? I mean, you know, he had to do something to respond to what happened to the Liz Truss mini-budget. And this was what he had to do because he had been dealt a very difficult hand.
That, what you just articulated, is the majority view, I think, right now, of Tory MPs. It's just that there are significant minorities who who beat their breasts and cry in anguish. And that's why Rishi Sunak is there, to do the sort of stuff that he just did. I mean, some of them would obviously put a little bit money here that he didn't put, or take some money away. And a lot of them say they'd like more on spending cuts, but if you ask them where, they're not terribly good at pointing you at that. But generally speaking, I think the majority of Conservative MPs, there's a reason Rishi Sunak is in number 10. It's because the majority of Tory MPs felt the party needed to do the sort of thing it's just done in that autumn statement, but that doesn't mean that even they like it. I mean, it's not exactly a love letter to the electorate.
What do they think that, even though the electorate, I mean, we don't really know how they're necessarily going to respond yet to this autumn statement. Is there a sense that with Sunak, he is still seen as a safe pair of hands during a difficult economic situation?
Yes, I think there is a sense that of the hands that were on offer, his are perhaps the safest. Is he prime ministerial? Does he generate that sort of authority? Does he give a sense of a vision? I mean, I wrote down a quote from something he said at the CBI conference. Someone asked a question about productivity. He said, a study from the Robotics Federation a couple of years ago, he remembered a study from the Robotics from 2 years ago, said we under-index for the amount of automation and robotics, even when you control for the sectoral mix of our economy. I mean imagine Boris Johnson even starting that sentence. He was, of course, addressed the CBI talking about Peppa Pig when he was there.
One last thing in terms of the Tory disquiet. You see a lot when we talk about, do we need to talk about Brexit, how we compare the British economy to other economies post-COVID. What is the narrative from those backbenchers? Is it that don't talk about Brexit, it's nothing to do with that? It's what, because we shouldn't have locked down X number of times, we're still having that hangover from COVID? How do they explain the dire situation the British economy seems compared to other Western neighbours?
We locked down harder and longer is one of the variables that they point to, I think with some justification. But the Tory party isn't under huge pressure to start talking about Brexit from Labour. This is quite key to where this sits in the whole sort of range of issues. Labour doesn't want to particularly go near that. And I think one of the other interesting things about Labour, and it comes back to what you were talking about the what they've done with this autumn statement, is Labour doesn't want to go too far outside the parameters of the spending limits that have been set, and it doesn't want to. It doesn't feel it has enough trust with the public to go boldly off on in a new direction. So to that extent, the whole sort of George Osborne play, let's set the tramlines of the debate, is working on the economy. And Labour's fear of going anywhere near Brexit means, well, that's not an issue. Labour feels if it started talking about Brexit, it would reignite the voters' feeling that they strongly detected after the Brexit vote that voters felt Labour thinks it knows best and isn't listening to me. And it would play into not just the wounds of Brexit, but many other wounds like that. Both the main parties seem to have a vested interest in not putting that in the middle of the debate.
We started by talking about how this autumn statement was sort of like a Gordon Brown budget. How is Labour responding? We did see Sir Keir Starmer at the CBI himself.
But our common goal must be to help the British economy off its immigration dependency, to start investing more in training workers who are already here. Migration is part of our national story. Always has been, always will be. And the Labour Party will never diminish the contribution it makes to our economy, to public services, to your businesses and our communities. But let me tell you, the days when low pay and cheap labour are part of the British way on growth must end.
What manoeuvrings are they doing? They still have, they're still 20-odd points ahead in the polls. How do they manoeuvre around this autumn statement then?
Cautiously is the answer. And you can see it in that immigration response. Labour Keir Starmer's trying to live down with certain sections of the electorate his past commitment to freedom of movement. He knows that's a killer phrase with certain voters, and he doesn't want to go near that, and he wants to frame his approach completely differently and try and get particular voters to buy into that. Of course, some people believe in freedom of movement, but that's not the voters he's got in mind and the ones he thinks Labour lost in the Red Wall. Generally speaking, Labour is being really careful about its own spending commitments. You get very strong echoes from Labour at the moment of those years leading up to the 97 general election when Gordon Brown tried to throttle any Labour spending promises. There were tiny ones, really, in the great scheme of things, made on Labour's pledge card that was issued at the time. They were meant to give an indication of direction of travel that Labour would like to go in if it got the money, and they really weren't that bold. You get a very strong sense that Labour is looking at a similar plan leading up to the next general election. Don't overpromise. What promises you do make, keep them incredibly tight, and brace yourself for this. Repeat the messages about how conscientious you are and prudent you are again and again and again. And if you go back through Gordon Brown's speeches, as I believe the Labour leadership have been, they've been marvelling at how much he dared to repeat himself. Brace yourself for a lot of repetition from them.
When we last spoke, we were talking about how Liz Truss made a mistake, it seemed, in not having any Sunak supporters within her cabinet. Mr. Sunak has done a completely different thing. He reappointed Suella Braverman, which he had a lot of criticism for. Does that show a weakness, though, in terms of his part? In that he has now sort of got himself tied up with the Suella Braverman. He's had criticism about Gavin Williamson, who had to resign. What's going on there? Does that show a weakness on his part or an actual genuine attempt to have unity? But ultimately, this is a party, as we've said many times, that is so divided on so many issues.
Well, I think you said it all there. I mean, it shows you have Gavin Williamson in your cabinet if you think you need a policeman to go round with a truncheon and know which people to hit in the party. And Gavin Williamson sold himself like that. Said he knew the party intimately, knew what made, who were the potential dissidents and the rest of it, and he had their number and he could case the joint and keep order for you. That's why he was in there. Suella Braverman's a very interesting name there because only just ejected from the cabinet. To pull her back did show, it was a moment of weakness. Rishi Sunak needed her support, needed to make sure her support didn't go to Boris Johnson in that key moment so that he could avoid a runoff election with Boris Johnson amongst Tory MPs and then amongst the party membership who might just, re-crown Boris Johnson and stick two fingers up at Rishi Sunak again. That was his fear.
Looking ahead, there's possible winter of discontent, possible more strikes. What are Conservative backbenchers looking for from Rishi Sunak in the weeks and months ahead?
Calm is what they want, is what they say they want, most of them. Some of them still want ideological purity and a return to the Liz Truss experiment, but they're a minority. It's really telling. There was one former cabinet minister I was chatting to just today, and he said, we've elected Rishi Sunak because we want 250 MPs after the next general election, not 150. And that you do hear variations of that sort of remark from quite a lot of Conservative MPs who have given up on winning, they might be wrong, and think that Liz Truss was taking them to a very, very dark place where it would take them 3 general elections to get back into power, whereas at least they argue they're still in contention if they're down to a floor of 250. Now, there will be all sorts of problems along the way. Rishi Sunak and his team will be trying to head them off. If there's a controversial piece of legislation, something that could attract 30-plus Tory rebels, they probably won't push it and they'll quietly bin it. And you can see that happening already. It's a process that is evolving. Rishi Sunak's first weeks in office have been taken up by preparing the autumn statement. He said about 80% of his time, about 20% of it spent on Channel boats. And he really hasn't. This is a government that is forming in front of us. It really hasn't had a time to work out exactly all the other things that they're going to push. But we're going to see them try to look busy and active without threatening their own majority. And that, at a time of incredible economic difficulty, is the extraordinary trick he's got to try to pull off.
And I guess one last thing there, when you talk about, MPs saying this is about, keeping it to 250 MPs, what's the sense from right up to number 10? Because you do read that, Sunak tells allies that, let's look to John Major's surprise victory in 1992. Is there still a genuine sense that if he does do what he's there to do, safe pair of hands, keep things calm, there could be a possibility of an election win?
I don't think if you're someone like Rishi Sunak, you come back into power and not have a small beam of light that you think you can follow into the distance that will take you to the to victory. Whether in his heart of hearts, deep down, he thinks it's a 20% chance, 30% chance, is very hard. It's impossible to know. But very few prime ministers think they're done for. And there are these amazing external forces that we are subject to at the moment that could change. They came upon us fast. They could disappear fast. Doesn't look like that, but that's got to be his hope. Equally, some of these external forces could get a lot worse. Imagine Russians suddenly breaking the gas pipeline from Norway to Britain. Imagine the Russians hitting a nuclear power station in Ukraine. There are so many awful possible scenarios that you can dream up at the moment, and they're not that far-fetched that could make the situation that we're in at the moment much, much worse.
Gary Gibbon, thank you for talking to me today. Thank you.
Thank you.